but just, dark. They were not covered in body hair the way she was. And they were ugly enough to make freight trains take dirt roads. Really, really ugly. But they did find mates, and they did marry, and they did produce families. Now, when she was buried in 1890, it's a Muslim area, so they didn't mark gravestones, but she was buried in the village cemetery, which contained a lot of bodies. So, of the 10 people who were still alive who had been at her funeral, they couldn't agree exactly where she was. They would have had to just excavate the cemetery to find her, which they weren't going to allow that to happen. But luckily, her youngest son, Kvit, had died only in 1954, which was only about 10 years from when they were doing the research. So they knew where his body was. And they allowed him to be exhumed so they could study his body. And they did. Now, before we see a skull, I want to tell you something. Neanderthals had bigger brains on average than we do. Bigger brains. 1,500 cc on average to our 1,400 cc. But we carry our extra in our foreheads up here. They carry theirs in a lump back here called the occipital bun. You can kind of see an image of it right here. Occipital bun. All right, now let's take a look at Kvit's skull. This is Anna's son, Kvit. Now notice, if you will, the remnant of an occipital bun here. Notice, too, that he has basically no forehead. He has these huge brow ridges, very large eyes, gigantic nasal passage relative to ours. Notice the size of the teeth, the size of the jaw, but notice, he has a chin. Now, why is that significant? Because her children could speak. Remember we've been talking about speaking? She never could, they couldn't. But somehow in the hybridization process, her children got the ability to speak. They all had high-pitched voices, but they could speak. And guess what else? They had normal intelligence. They weren't geniuses, but they weren't bozos. Normal intelligence. So the human characteristics dominated every time in the hybridization process. Okay? So he had a chin, he could speak, but you can see the zygomatic arches here. This is an ugly dude. You do not want to run into this guy in a dark alley. Now, what we're told is this is an extreme variation of the human norm. This is what how anthropologists explain this away. It's an extreme variation of the human. Well, it's pretty doggone extreme. I'll agree with them on that. I don't know anybody that extreme, and I don't think you do either. So, if everything that I'm telling you is true, and I believe that it is, what does it mean? It means that the so-called pre-humans are nothing more than the ancestors of today's living hominoids. And what does that mean for humans? It means that we are off the flowchart of natural development of life on Earth. We do not belong here. We did not develop here. And that is why science and that is why religion will fight tooth and nail to keep these guys from being recognized as real. Because the day one of these is real, that's the day they have to go back to the drawing board and redesign everything that they believe in and that they postulate. So if you were in their shoes, you wouldn't handle it any different, and I wouldn't either, and I don't blame them a bit. But that is what they're doing. Now, if it's true, then we're off the flowchart. Where did we come from? That's what we're going to talk about next. Okay, next slide, please. I think those answers are going to come from Sumer, right here. Sumer. Tigris-Euphrates Valley, Zagros Mountains, Tigris River, Euphrates River system, and then down into the Persian Gulf. Modern-day Iraq, Saddam Hussein country, we all know the drill. We all know what this is like. This is where it comes from. The Sumerians were the first great culture on the planet, walked out of the Stone Age at around 6,000 years ago, possessing over 100 of the firsts that we attribute to a high civilization. Over 100. They had everything. Now, we're not taught that for the simple reason that it makes no sense in terms of the Darwinian paradigm. They were better, more sophisticated than the Egyptians, Greeks, and the Romans. So what do we have to say if we teach it correctly? The first great culture first culture out of the Stone Age is the best, and we go straight downhill from there to the Dark Ages, and then we begin to sort of claw our way back up on our own. Now, does that fit the Darwinian paradigm? No, it does not, so we got to leave those guys off the table. And we start with the Egyptians, Greeks, and Romans. But nonetheless, this is the case. All right, next slide. Let's look at some of the things they had. They had the first great cities. This is Ur, one of their cities. First great cities, first well-organized cities, first city centers, first plazas, first high-rise buildings, very high, over 100 feet, all done with mud bricks. They had walled cities. They had roads, as you can see. They had wonderful agriculture. They had animal husbandry. They had the first wheeled vehicles. They had the first ocean-going vessels. They had the first laws, the first government, the first judges, the first courts, the first economics. They had the first mathematics. They had the first astronomy, and they had astonishing astronomy. They had better mathematics than we have. Their system, based on the number 60 sexagesimal, is better than ours for working with very small numbers and very large numbers. It really doesn't make sense that you walk out of the Stone Age having a culture this sophisticated. There's no way to make sense of that. Furthermore, they had widespread education, and they had the one thing we are taught about the Sumerians. If you were taught anything about them, you were taught this and nothing else. They produced the first writing, right? Remember? First writing, cuneiform, is what we're taught. Okay, in that writing, next slide, the writing was left, where do we find that? In their libraries. They had the first libraries. What was the writing done on? On clay. It was all they had. No trees, no stones, just clay, so they used what was at hand. And their language, cuneiform, is a very sophisticated, mathematically based language. And most of the tablets of the 100,000 or more that we have are these like that fit in your hand. But then when they had larger stories to tell, they would put them on, large sheets of clay, and then they would fire them in a kiln, another of their inventions. Kiln, very hard to make a kiln work, if you know anything about that. And they'd fire the clay into stone. This is the original written in stone. You hear the term, well, that's written in stone. Well, that's where it comes from. There's no rewriting this. The Bible and everything else has been rewritten. No, you don't rewrite this. This is it. This is the word right here. Okay, and so, but are we told what they said in those? No, we're not. They did the first writing, and that's it. Let's move on to the Egyptians. Don't tell what they talked about. Mostly what they talk about is just their business dealings, just like us. What's going on with contracts and legal deals and like that. But about 5,000 of those tablets deal with their cosmology and their cosmogony, what they thought, how the world developed, how the solar system developed, and how life came to be on Earth, and how we came to be on Earth. And when these were being translated, these were the last great culture to be uncovered, understand, in the late 1800s and early 1900s. These things are being translated, and the translators are looking at it saying, gee whiz, these guys, wow, this is absolutely far out. And it did sound kind of like the mythology of the Egyptians, the Greeks, and the Romans, except they preceded the Egyptians by about 1,000 years. So they said, oh, well, that's mythology, that's just myth. So let's just put it off in the myth pile, which they did, and they didn't worry about it. It didn't seem to occur to anybody that if you're the first culture, who do you get mythology from? Who passes it on to you? Well, in the 1950s, a man named Zecharia Sitchin asked that question. And he went into the myth pile, and he began to treat it as a history rather than as a mythology. And he began to try to figure out what they were trying to tell us about our history or their history as they understood it. And he has since written 7 books, starting with the 12th planet in 1976, that deals with what the Sumerians had to say about our history, the history of humanity. Now what we're going to go over is that. Part 4 of my book, you've already been through the first 3 parts. Part 4 basically is like the Cliff Notes to Sitchin's work, and if you've heard about it or are interested in it, this would be a good way to start. Introduce yourself to it. Okay? Let's start with that. This is what the Sumerians say in their tablets, that originally there was the sun, there was the Mercury, there was Venus, Mars, and another planet known as Tiamat, and then Jupiter, Saturn, Pluto as a moon of Saturn, Uranus, Neptune, and then into that forming solar system at around 4 billion years ago came a rogue planet, a stray planet called Nibiru. Now, we all saw in the last few weeks one of these planets being ejected, a rogue planet, a stray planet being ejected from a forming solar system. So that would explain one of the tough questions I used to have to deal with: where did it come from? I didn't know. Now I know that the solar system, that the universe does actually produce these stray planets. So anyway, for whatever reason, wherever it came from, it came in as it too was forming, but it was considerably older than these, but it was still forming, it was still viscous, it was still plasmid. It was just older and better put together than were these, which were really just forming at around 4 billion years ago. And it came in on the ecliptic, but clockwise rather than the counterclockwise circles of the others. As you can see, it comes out on a much flatter plane clockwise. Well, so the outer planets grab it and pull it in toward the sun. The sun captures it for real and puts it in an orbit like this, clockwise ellipse. Okay? Now, but as we can see, we've got the possibility for problems. Why? Because one's going one way and all the others are going the other way. Next slide, please. And so what happens is, in the second time around, there is a disaster. There's a collision between Nibiru and Tiamat. Now, this whole story that I'm going to go over with you now is told in the classic Sumerian epic of creation called the Enuma Elish. 6 full tablets going over this in some detail in an allegorical story about battling gods in the skies and the heavens. But it's very easy to figure out that we're talking about the planets and the formation of the solar system. All right? And this is the story that Enuma Elish tells. And in telling its story, they answered plausibly 5 of the current great mysteries of astronomy and Earth geology. And we're going to go over those real quick here. The first great mystery is comets. Well, what the Sumerians say is that as Nibiru smashed into Tiamat, its light outer crust, the part that contained the water, was splattered in all directions because it's light and it just went flying in all directions. Now, one of the great mysteries of the solar system is comets. Because in a linear universe, you remember that forming cloud of gas, and I said it all had to be on the ecliptic? Well, nothing should be off the ecliptic in a true linear universe. Comets do not belong. Comets, there's no place for them in the normal scheme of things, and yet there they are, coming from all over the place. This gives a plausible reason for where they would have come from, and I accept that. Furthermore, the asteroid belt, another great mystery. What they say, the Sumerians, is that the inner thick viscous magma, not the lighter part, the outer crust, the inner part was pulled out and strung out and broke into little pieces which become the asteroid belt, the hammered bracelet they call it, asteroid belt. Now, the asteroid belt is a great mystery because according to Bode's law, which some of you may know, there's this mathematical progression of planets should be at a certain place. Well, most things are pretty much where they belong, except for the asteroid belt. There should be a good-sized planet where the asteroid belt is, and there's nothing but something that if you swept it all together, it wouldn't be a lot bigger than Pluto. So something's bad wrong with the asteroid belt as it is today, but as you see, according to the Sumerians, here you have the right planet in the right place. But disaster, caused that to change. All right. Now, furthermore, what they say is that Nibiru's moon, north wind, banged into the remnant of Tiamat and knocked it inside with its moon, Kingu, knocked it inside the orbit of Mars, like, 2 pool balls ricocheting. Meanwhile, and of course it had been banged that way a little bit too, but Nibiru's also knocked a little off by the collision. So, in this collision, they say, here's a real winner. Anybody need to get that? Okay. What they say is that in the collision between Nibiru and Tiamat, Nibiru passed life to Tiamat. In the collision, Nibiru passed life to Tiamat. Do you remember about Earth and life? Mysteriously, inexplicably, around 4 million years ago, we get not one but 2 forms of fairly advanced single-cell prokaryotic bacteria. Remember? This explains it. Nibiru had it. And we got it in that collision. Makes sense, doesn't it? Now, furthermore, the remnant, Tiamat, became the Earth. The remnant of Tiamat became the Earth. Now, 2 of the great mysteries of Earth geology are this. Earth has tectonics, and Earth has missing crust. A huge part of its crust is missing. If you've ever seen a picture of the globe of the Earth with the water drained off, it's a very lopsided mess. You can see something bad happened to Earth somewhere in the past. What happened? Here we go. What they say is that the outside, the backside of Tiamat was cracked in the process. It was cracked like an eggshell. And then, as we all know, none of the other planets in the solar system are like Earth. In the the other planets in the solar system, all the planets and all the moons do what liquids do in the vacuum of space. We've all seen it in the space shuttle. What do? You let a liquid loose in a space shuttle, what happens? It pulls itself into the tightest ball that it can, does it not? That is the physics of a vacuum. So all of the planets and moons except Earth have done that, pulled themselves into